I want to show you why there is migration. And the hypothesis is that in this context, migration is driven by the negative effect on agricultural production. So just following previous literature, we would expect that if the temperature increases, we should see this negative effect on agricultural production and productivity. So in order to do that, we are going to run this regression model. This is using the agricultural survey. So the outcome of interest is going to be the log of total production or production per hectare. T is going to measure this temperature shock, that is the number of weeks with a temperature shock during the main harvest season. We control for time variant characteristics, both at the producer level and municipality level. Importantly, as Sandra was saying, we control for precipitation in this context. And importantly, the results are pretty robust, controlling for this or not. We have municipality and year fixed effects and control for pre-trends to take into account any differential trends across these municipalities. Our standard errors are going to be clustered both at the municipality and year level. And as expected, what we see this drop in agricultural production. So what you see here in the purple is that productivity is going to decrease by 5.4% with each additional week with high temperatures. And that translates on a total negative effect on production that decreases by 2.8%. So this is like the first thing that we needed to know, that, okay, this is also happening in El Salvador, as we have seen in other contexts. Now, what is interesting is like, okay, we see this negative effect. Are farmers going to adjust to this, and how are they adjusting? So our hypothesis is that they are going to adjust, but the thing is that we need to understand at what margin are they going to be able to adjust. There are some investments that are already done, and it's not going to be so easy to adjust. Something that they can do is to adjust by changing labor demand. And how can they change those costs? Well, they can just substitute hired workers for domestic workers. So this is our first hypothesis. And that is exactly what we find. So this again is using the agricultural survey. And what we're going to see what is the effect of this shock on the total number of workers. And what you see in the first column, and just like to clarify here, that the dependent variable uses the hyperbolic sign transformation, since we have some households that have either like 0 hired workers or 0 domestic workers, so to avoid dropping zeros. So what you see is that there is a decrease on the number of workers, and this is all driven by a decrease in hired workers. So there is an adjustment through the labor market. Now, what is happening at the individual level? So to compensate for income fall, we would expect agricultural workers to either increase working hours if they are domestic workers, or to move to the non-agricultural sector or migrate. So let's start by looking at what is happening in the labor sector, and this is very consistent with the story that I was telling you before. So we are going to just complement what we see at the household level by looking at labor outcomes at the individual level. And what we see is that with one additional week with a temperature shock, there is an increase in weekly hours only of domestic workers. And there is a decrease in the likelihood of working for hired workers. And this is like around a 1.6% decrease relative to baseline. So taking both the evidence from like the household level and the individual level, we see that agricultural workers, like the labor market, there is an adjustment to the shock through the labor market. Now we would expect also to see an adjustment through the decision to migrate. And importantly, because of the structure of the data, we can only look at international migration. Also, because of the structure of the data, we cannot see individual migration. This is going to be at the household level. So in this case, the dependent variable is just going to be a dummy equal to 1 if someone in the household migrated during that year. I'm going to multiply this by 100.
Can I ask another question?
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you so much. So I was thinking, so you probably, I don't know if you have thought about that, but you have here a lower, if this is the case, you do not observe those households who left completely. In other words, you cannot observe those who are not there as a whole. And I wonder, have you had a chance to see through that bias and maybe understand if there's anything you can say to kind of let us know how big that is?
That is a great question, Sandra, because if we are missing all these households that are migrating completely, it is also hard to know what is the bias because we don't know who they are. So the best we can do is the following. We are going to compare just trends of what are the trends of like the migration when we use the EHPM and when we use the American Community Survey, that is the US-based data that allows us to know like how many migrants are coming each year from El Salvador. And when we compare, the trends are actually pretty similar. This is all just trends. We're not comparing characteristics. But by 2015 is a terrible year. If you saw the maps, the temperature shock is like, it's crazy that year, right? Also, if you see violence, that 2015 was a bad year. And we see the drop. Like we see that in the ACS, we have like this consistent flow, and in the AHPM, it goes down. So there is clearly 2015, we are missing households that are migrating completely, like where they are leaving the country. The best we can do, and if you have more ideas, we would love to hear that. The best we can do is that for now, we run the regression without 2015, and the results are pretty consistent. So it doesn't seem that this is the year that is driving all the results. But again, would love to hear more about what to do with that.
I have an idea, but it's not.
Yes.
You cannot do this with observational data. And so I don't know if it's worth it, but if you could do this in a small sample, like say a very small sample, if you were able to kind of get, a couple of $1,000 and go to a small town that has a lot of migration and ask people, of the people that you know, how many people have left in your neighborhood, the whole household because of weather shocks, and kind of get a little bit of more precise evidence as to how common this is. And then this is great because if you're finding an effect, it's just saying this is a lower bound effect of a true effect. But then it would be interesting to kind of have a bound on the other side. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm trying to say? How large could this be? Are we talking about, how much money would be justify in that sense? Yeah. Like how much investment would we be willing to prevent this, to invest to prevent this from happening?
Yes. No, I think that is super important. Particularly, we want to say things about like policy implications of this. And we actually have some money that we can use, and that is a great idea. So we would love to keep picking your brain about this. Okay, so now let's look what is happening with international migration. And as we see, there is like this strong effect. And nicely, like that is consistent with what I have been telling you, this is all driven by agricultural households. So we see that one additional week with a temperature shock increases the likelihood of migration by 0.2 percentage points. That is actually 25% relative to the mean. And again, this is all driven by agricultural households. When we look at non-agricultural households, not only the effect is not significantly different from zero, but the coefficient is very close to zero. And the last piece of evidence that I want to show you quickly in the last minutes is that now we would expect this effect on agricultural labor markets and on migration to depend on access to risk-coping mechanisms. And the hypothesis is that if there's no access to risk-coping mechanisms, the effect should transmit more to agricultural labor markets, right? They need to rely more on that adjustment and therefore on migration. But if they have access to risk-coping mechanisms, maybe they don't need to rely so much on like this labor market. That is exactly what we find. So let me explain you quickly what you see here. In order to proxy for access to risk-coping mechanisms, we are going to use access to migrants. It could be the share of migrants or the share of remittances. The results tell you the same story. So what you are going to see here is the effect for households who live in municipalities with lower access to migrants or remittances. That is what you see here in like the salmon color. And in the greenish color, you see households that live in municipalities with higher share of migrants and remittances. What you see is that all the story that I have told you on the effect on labor markets is driven by households living in municipalities with lower access of these informal prescoping mechanisms. So they don't have access to it. They need to rely more on the labor market, and we see this larger effect. Then we would expect that to translate on migratory decisions, and that is what we find. So we see that access to migrant networks and remittances affect likelihood to migrate. The impact on likelihood of migration is lower in regions with higher share of migrants and remittances, which suggests that receiving remittances might help to alleviate the negative temperature shock and increase the likelihood of staying in the place of origin. In addition, this I didn't show you here, but in addition, we also see some suggestive evidence that credit-constrained households and non-landowners are more likely to migrate. We have a bunch of robustness checks. We define the temperature shock in a different way. That we look at like different periods, like addressing what Sandra was saying. We test the validation of the identification strategy with a placebo test. And we also explore other plausible mechanisms, but the results are very robust. So let me now conclude in the last 2 minutes. We see that there is evidence of a strong negative effect of these temperature shocks on agricultural production, and agricultural producers are adjusting to this by cutting back labor demand. So in this context, labor markets are an important transmission mechanism of the negative weather shocks, temperature shocks in particular. Agricultural workers are going to respond to this by either moving to the non-agricultural sector, this is one part that we still are exploring, work in progress, or migrating internationally. So there are 2 types of migration that are going to emerge from this relationship. One is migration as a strategy to survive and compensate for income losses. And another one is a migration as a way out of poverty in regions with untenable conditions, including untenable conditions driven by climate change. Policies should respond to these types, to the 2 types of migration. In order to deal with distress migration, where agricultural production is still feasible, then we should think about programs that, that facilitate access to prescoping mechanisms, technical assistance, and productive public goods. But also when there is like this migration as a way out of poverty, we should think about ways to remove obstacles that facilitate this type of migration, and access to financial markets or ways to finance this migration are potential ideas. Thank you very much, and I'm glad my computer didn't collapse, so I survived.
That was great, Andrea. So let me see how we're doing. So we're exactly on time. So unfortunately, if anyone has questions, it would be great. Carlos Andres, I'm very sorry if you could please talk in the chat with Andrea so that I give Clotilde enough time to present her paper, if that's okay with you, Andrea.
Yes, yes, please.
Yes? Okay. So now we're going to have Clotilde, and please, if you can please share your screen. You're going to have as well, oh, that's your clock. So you were perfectly on time. You're going to have 25 minutes as well. She's going to present Panic, Growing Angst over Immigration and Crime. And feel free to ask questions during the presentation so that you can, we have a more interactive discussion. Welcome, Clotilde, and thanks for presenting.
Thanks, Sandra. So hi, everyone. So before I start presenting, I think my internet today is not that stable. So I hope it's not going to freeze. I hope you will understand what I'm going to present, but please don't hesitate to interrupt, and just I will repeat what I said. So as Sandra mentioned, I'm going to present you some work in progress with Sergio, who is based in Quito in Ecuador, on the link between immigration and crime. So as many of you might know, immigration raises many questions, and among them, crime tends to be one of the main concerns often before fears over negative labor market effects. With regard to the existing literature on immigration and crime, the evidence that we have today mainly comes from developed economies and is rather mixed. That is, we know that immigration is not associated with violent crime, but it seems that there is a positive link with property crime that might be explained by the limited labor market perspectives of some undocumented migrant groups, just as underprivileged local groups. In addition, immigration was found to deteriorate locals' legal economic prospects, which would nudge them to engage in criminal activities. And recently, it has been found that fears over immigration and crime might be explained by changes in crime perception and anti-immigrant sentiment, which very likely result from greater media coverage and some sort of instrumentalization by populist political parties. In this sense, we believe that studying potential crime responses to immigration remains of particular interest because of the few and the mixed literature on the topic and rising xenophobia worldwide. So in a nutshell, we examine whether immigration affects crimes in an emerging middle-income country, Ecuador. We are going to rely on national representative, administrative, and survey data, and we will exploit the fact that immigration flows of Venezuelans to Ecuador suddenly evolved from voluntary to forced and occurred disproportionately along land borders. As a short preview of our results, in case I don't have time to go through the end of my presentation. So we precisely estimate an economically null effect of Venezuelan immigration on property and violent crime. And using data on perceptions, we find that Ecuadorians tend to believe that immigration worsens the economy, which might explain fears of immigration over crime as well. In this sense, we believe that results confirm that fears over immigration and crime in Ecuador are not supported by the facts, but rather by fears. Of course, we are not the first to explore the immigration-crime relationship, but we hope that we contribute to this literature by first providing a comprehensive and internally valid analysis using both admin and survey-based information. And we hope that using these different types of information will guarantee some sort of external validity so that our results might be informative for countries of similar development levels, such as Colombia, Jordan, Lebanon, but that these results might also provide evidence for more established economies on possible scenarios when unexpected and large immigration flows might put to test the strength of host country institutions. So to give you a bit of context, so Venezuela used to be some sort of an economic miracle, but gradually oil shocks and currency crises drove the country into unrest. We have seen wealthy Venezuelans fleeing for years to save the country, to fly the country, to save their capital from expropriation and high inflation. But in 2016, various economic and political events marked the beginning of the collapse of Venezuelan politics and economy. And what has been shown in various papers, but what we can also infer from the data, is that Venezuelans emigrating since 2016 are increasingly destitute and poorly educated, and they escape desperate situations in Venezuela. So we have some sort of a change from a somehow voluntary migration to a much more involuntary and forced migration. When it comes to Ecuador, so we know that Venezuelans initially fled to border countries such as Colombia, which has attracted a lot of academic and political attention. But Ecuador also experienced a sharp increase in the number of Venezuelan immigrants. In 2018, it was the third Latin American recipient of Venezuelan immigrants. What is particularly interesting about Ecuador is that Venezuelans could legally enter Ecuador without visa or passport, only with their IDs, and they automatically had a status of refugee that allowed them to obtain permanent residency so that they were not legally denied work, at least a priori. And since 2016, the characteristics of Venezuelan inflows changed. This is what we can see, for instance, by the way Venezuelans entered Ecuador. That is, from 2016 onwards, they privileged more and more land border crossings, which are some of the cheapest options to enter the country. This is what you can see on this table. So this table is based on administrative data recording individual immigration flows of Ecuadorians and non-Ecuadorians in Ecuador. This data gives information on the exact date of entry, on how they entered the country and where, so whether they entered through airport and which airport, or a harbor, or a bridge. And they also give some information about the nationality of immigrants. And what you can see on the left panel of this table is that first, from 2016 onwards, there is an increase in the absolute number of Venezuelans entering the country, as well as in the share of Venezuelans entering the country over total immigration flows. On the right side of the panel, of the table, you can see that how Ecuadorians entered the country changed from 2016 onwards, with Venezuelans entering more and more by land border crossings. And this is what, so we see less of a drastic change in how people entered when looking at all inflows, but it seems that also from 2016 onwards, we have more and more individuals entering by land, very likely explained by Venezuelan inflows. So the main empirical challenge that we have for this project is that we do not observe Venezuelan immigration by canton, by year. So as a short remember, Ecuador is divided in about 20 provinces and then about 200 cantons. So ideally, we would observe yearly exposure to Venezuelan immigration at the canton level. This is information we do not have. So what we are going to do, we are going to use these individual administrative records on migrant inflows to Ecuador from 2014 to 2018 to kind of come up with a predicted Venezuelan inflow measure. We are going to exploit 3 facts to do so. So first, since Venezuela 2016 hyperinflation crisis, immigration flows have been larger and dominated by Venezuelans in Ecuador. Second, post-2016 Venezuelan inflows are increasingly destitute and likely false, which can be inferred by them privileging land border crossings, which is the cheapest means of entry in Ecuador. And the third fact that we are going to exploit is that the travel distance from border crossings to a specific area in Ecuador, a canton, tends to be a key determinant of forced immigrants' location decisions. This is based from evidence from the forced migration and displacement literature. So we are going to
Can I interrupt? There is, I think, a very good comment from Fancy Fabrizio, so that we can have a more dynamic discussion. I think
yes.
His question is, have you thought about the possibility of also kind of mixing these results with, so Colombia had a previous large migration, internal forced migration, and it could be interesting to kind of think through whether these prompted the same effects that you find, or if there's a different story. Is it not the migration per se, or is the nationality of the migrants? I guess that's the very interesting question to think about.
Yes, I'm not so sure I understood well. I think something that might differ from Colombia is that very likely the Venezuelan immigrants that decide to go to Ecuador are somehow self-selected. So, I mean, you would expect Venezuelan immigrants to go first to Colombia because this is really the closest country, it's a border country. But since to go to Ecuador, you need to go through Colombia or maybe through Brazil and Peru. So those arriving in Ecuador very likely would be by definition self-selected somehow. Now, I'm not so sure we would have enough information to know how they are, if they are. I'm not so sure if it answers your question, but yes, I think you would have a bit of a different kind of migration. In addition, based on my understanding, and also my co-author is Colombian, what happens is that Ecuador might be much more of a final destination than Colombia, because Ecuador as an economy is much more stable. So maybe you would expect that many Venezuelans consider Colombia not at a final destination. So there might be also some sort of effects from there. But yeah, I would need maybe to think about it a bit more deeply. All right. Okay, so maybe I will just continue. We construct this V, which is a continuous variable, as a function of Venezuelans inflow, which is a total number of Venezuelans who entered Ecuador through the closest land border crossing K in year T, divided by distance, which is a shorted pairwise travel distance between the centroid of some of the 200 cantons of Ecuador and the closest land border crossing K, knowing that during a period of analysis, there were 8 existing and operating land border crossings. As you can see on this map, so we have located basically the different border crossings. So in yellow, you have airports, in red, land borders, and in blue, ports. So basically, what is going to happen is that unpredicted Venezuelan inflows are going to capture the amount of individuals of Venezuelans entering through the red points. So basically in the north at the border with Colombia, and in the south at the border with Peru, knowing that given that most of the Venezuelans enter through Colombia, we will have much more weights towards the north, assigned to the north of the country. And this is what you can see on these 3 maps. So where represented the result of our predicted Venezuelan inflows per 10,000 inhabitants in 2014 at the beginning of our period on the left, 2016 in the center, and 2018 on the right, which is the end of our period of analysis. And as you can see, the darker the area, the more Venezuelans were assigned, and it's mainly in the north of the country. So when it comes to the dependent variables, so we are going to rely on both administrative records and nationally representative survey data. From administrative records, we have information on criminal offenses, on death records, and how people died, and hospital discharges, and why people were admitted to a hospital, so that we are going to create a balanced canton year panel of criminal offenses, death by homicide, and injury-related hospitalization per 10,000 inhabitants from 2014 to 2018 for all cantons of Ecuador. We are then going to rely on nationally representative survey data to gather information on victimization, because data on crime often tend to be misreported. So victimization data from surveys might give additional information. We are also going to rely on information from the Americas barometers, which is very similar to the Latino barometer. This survey is going to give us information not only on crime victimization and feeling of safety, but also on anti-immigrant sentiment, labor market outcomes, and political ideologies. Importantly, survey data are not representative at the canton level. They are nationally representative because they are self-weighted. So we are going to process them at the respondent level as full cross-sections. And in practice, we are going to estimate this, so reduced form specifications. In equation 2, you have the specification that we estimate for canton year panel data. So we have our dependent variable, which is going to be a rate of crime per 10,000 inhabitants. On the right-hand side, we have V, our predicted Venezuelan inflows. We control for distance. We control for a set of predetermined content characteristics that we allow to differ by year. And we include a set of canton and year fixed effects, as well as province-specific traits. With survey data in specification 3, we are going to estimate a similar reduced form specifications, but at the individual level. And we are also going to control for a set of individual and household characteristics. So here I'm presenting the baseline specifications with the panel of canton year data. In panel A, information on property crime, and basically in our column 4, which is our preferred specifications, in which we included canton, year, province year fixed effect, as well as a set of predetermined covariates. We see that Venezuelan inflows is positively related with property crime per 10,000 inhabitants, but that the magnitude of the effect is extremely small. And this estimate can be interpreted as the increase in 1 Venezuelan per 10,000 inhabitants would result in a 0.0001 increase in property crime per 10,000 inhabitants. Looking at average increase in Venezuelan inflows, this would lead to a 0.03% increase in property crime, which is statistically significant, but economically meaningless. In the last column, column 5, we standardized both the independent and the dependent variable so that we can interpret this estimate as a 1 standard deviation increase in Venezuelan inflows, resulting in 1.24 percentage points standard deviation increase in property crime. Based on the literature, we would consider a 20% increase of in terms of standard deviation as a modest but non-negligible effect. So in this case, we are quite far from the 20% increase. So in this sense, yeah, this is quite a negligible effect. Yes, someone who maybe would you like to take the floor and just ask your question? You raised your hand.
Yes, thanks, Clotilde, and thanks for allowing me to do my question. It is rather a suggestion rather than a question. So something that I may suggest is that you use a log-log regression so that you can interpret the results as an increasing 1 percentage point or an increasing 1% in the population of Venezuelans. How much would that affect the percentage of property crimes? Standard deviations are also good, but probably you will have larger effects, although probably, I mean, larger, quote unquote, if you do a log-log regression, but that's only a suggestion.
Thanks a lot. Okay, thanks for your suggestion. So when we look at panel B for violent crime, we end up with a similarly statistically significant effect, but also meaningless in terms of magnitude. So something that might be worth mentioning is that in terms of the sign of our coefficients, we do find something that is in line with the literature, that is a positive link between immigration and property crime, but a negative link between immigration and violent crime. But with regard to the magnitude of this effect, these are meaningless. So now looking at homicide coming from the data on death, vital statistics in column 4 and 5, we also find similarly negative but extremely small effect. And in panel D, using data on hospitalization for injury per 10,000 inhabitants, we lose statistical significance. Then we try to look at potential heterogeneity, even if effects are kind of meaningless, you know, maybe there is still something there. And what we see is that the very small increase in property crime might be explained by simple theft, so basically pickpocketing, or non-residential burglary, so yeah, robbing shops, businesses. And this is what you can see in panel A. In panel B, what we see is that the decrease in violent crime might be explained by a decrease in stabbing and in violent crime involving male victims, which makes sense because when it comes to homicides, male victims tend to be the greatest number of victims. In column 5, we looked at homicides involving only Venezuelan victims. So here we lose totally statistical significance. But what is potentially interesting is that actually the sign of the coefficient estimate changes and the magnitude gets way bigger. This would suggest that Venezuelan immigration, if there is an increase in crime, would result in an increase in crime involving Venezuelan victims. And although this estimate is not significant, it is in line actually with some evidence coming from Colombia that shown that Venezuelan immigration was linked to an increase in homicide, but involving Venezuelan victims. So then we try to assess.
I'm sorry, you have 2 minutes.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. So then we look at the robustness of our Venezuelan inflow, predicted Venezuelan inflow measure by looking at 3 different indicators. In equation 4, basically what we do an average of the total number of Venezuelans entering Ecuador through all 28 entry points existing and operating during a period of analysis, divided by the shortest pairwise travel distance between a canton and one of these 28 destination entry points. Then instead of looking at levels, we are going to look at ratios of Venezuelans inflow entering through land border crossings. And last, we are going to resort to more traditional ethnic enclave or shift share variable to proxy migration by interacting a time varying variable, which is Venezuela Consumer Price Index yearly variation change, with a canton varying variable, which is a share of Venezuelans living in a canton in Ecuador in 2010. And what you can see on this table is that whatever measures we use of predicted migration Venezuelan inflows, we get similar results. Okay, and for death by homicide and hospitalization for injury. And last, we are going to rely on the survey data first on victimization. So basically, as I've suggested, as I mentioned before, we use these various waves of survey data at the individual level as pool cross-sections. Importantly, our Venezuelan inflow indicator here is standardized. And what we see basically is that when it comes to victimizations, when we are able to precisely estimate effects such as in column 6 or in column 8, effects are in magnitude economically insignificant. And last, we use this America's barometer to try to better understand whether the fears and the tensions that exist in Ecuador when it comes to Venezuelan immigration might be explained by some sort of beliefs, some sort of fears. And what we see, for instance, in column 1, that Venezuelan inflows seem to be linked to an increase in Ecuadorians believing that immigrants are bad for the economy. Although in column 7, you can see that there isn't much of a negative effect on the labor market. But that at the same time, Ecuadorians do not agree that immigrants should not receive social welfare. So it seems that that Venezuelan immigration really some sort of triggers some sort of fears among the Ecuadorian population when it comes to labor market issues, and which can somehow be translated to fears of a crime. And on this, I will conclude. So with this paper, we hope to provide novel evidence on crime response to immigration in an emerging Latin American country. We hope to do so by precisely estimating an economically null effect of immigration on property and violent crime, victimization and feeling of safety. But we also show that locals, in this case Ecuadorians, tend to believe that immigrants worsen economic prospects in spite of clear negative labor market effects. So we hope that we are able to provide a strongly internally valid empirical analysis by exploiting the importance, timing, and the characteristics of the recent Venezuelan wave in Ecuador. And we also hope that by deriving results from various national representative data sources, we guarantee strong external validity. And ultimately, we think that the absence of a causal crime effect of immigration suggests that the idea immigrants cause crimes is indeed explained by fears rather than facts. So thanks a lot for your for being here and being present. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Clotilde. So I am going to dive in right in so that I get a chance to also go through the slides. And so I'm going to share screen. I just want to be sure that you are seeing. If you can give me the thumbs up, that would be great. Or are you able to see the screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so the paper that I will present today is going to be joint work with a large group of co-authors. So Ana María Ibáñez at the University of Los Andes, and IDB, Andrés Moya, RRAs for the project, María de Laila and José Urbina, who have contributed so much. We decided that they needed to be part of the project, as well as co-authors, and Marisol Rodriguez from IDB. We also had support from IPA Colombia to run this project. So basically, in a nutshell, so that you know what I will be doing, what I will do in this project is talk to you a little bit about what are the impacts that we observe of a very large-scale regularization of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. But the effects we're going to analyze today correspond to the effects on migrants. So our motivation is, I would say, two big trends that we observe in the data. The first one is that most of the refugee migration flows that we observe in the world are actually hosted in developing nations, meaning middle to poor countries. So here in this graph, you're seeing the ranking of the top 20 countries that host the most refugees in the world. And what we actually observe there is that of those 20 countries, approximately 18 are developing countries. So Colombia is the second one with approximately 1.7 million people. But Turkey is the first country. So despite the fact that we observe, for those of us who are actually living in developed countries like the US, we see a lot of media, let's say, noise about the impacts that migrants have and the effects of refugees. This is a negligible migration flow, and most of the refugees are actually hosted in the south of the world. In these countries, there is a huge heterogeneity in terms of the policies of countries towards these refugees. So say, for example, Bangladesh is very restrictive, and they are like, you're in refugee camps, you cannot go out, you cannot work. Until very recently, they actually were granted the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar internet access. Other countries have more intermediate approaches, like Peru and Turkey, Jordan, where if you have education, if you work in certain sector, if you have a firm that sponsors you, you can have, let's say, a job, a formal job, but otherwise you cannot. And Colombia, I would say, is one of the most generous countries, saying you have free mobility, and actually they have promoted one of the biggest amnesties that we have seen in modern history. So our question and contribution is going to be to try to identify the impacts of a large-scale migrant regularization, meaning what happens when you grant irregular migrants, those that do not have documents to be in the country, the possibility of accessing safety nets, labor markets. What will happen with migrants? And a lot of people might think this is very obvious, and the answer is not at all. So specifically, one of the papers that we did earlier with Ana María and Dani Bahar, which is already published at the JDE, shows that this very large amnesty of approximately 500,000 people did not impact the host natives in Colombia. And so because of that, this motivated this paper. We thought, how come? How can you regularize this amount of people and nothing happens in the market? So we decided we needed to explore and do a survey and figure out what was going on. So we're gonna examine the effects on labor markets, access to state services, well-being, integration, but also heterogeneous effects. In the paper, we're not gonna have time today to talk about that, but we're also going to explore in the paper effects by gender, age, and attitude. So existing evidence mostly focus in the northern countries and on partial progress. And why do we think that what we do is different? Well, we're gonna have a very large regularization with no eligibility criteria. Anyone who can prove to be Venezuelan and does not have documents should be able to apply. It's gonna create very different effects to the ones prompted on, say, United States or Italy or Europe or Canada, because informality in developing countries is very large. So for those of you who live in developing countries or who are born in developing countries or who have traveled to developing countries, you know that informality makes it so that migrants may be part of the productive system already. And so they may be working and they might not be interested in formalizing. So they might be thinking, you know what, I don't want to use this thing to jump to the formal sector. I don't want to pay taxes, but let me use this to get access to safety net. And this is something we needed to understand. So we're also going to try to not focus basically on labor outcomes as most previous work, but let's also think about mental health. So when you give people a document, would that change their willingness to report crimes, to report violations against their human rights as workers? Would they feel better? Would they feel more integrated? And I think this is very important. We thought in our research team that was a very important dimension that was not explored before. So let me tell you about this program. So the program we call the PEP, and the PEP is just Permiso Especial de Permanencia, but there were many PEPs in Colombia. What is interesting about this one is that this was given for vulnerable migrants, so those without documents, basically people with no passport, people who just crossed the border and they didn't actually went to the appropriate channels to do that. In this crowd, I don't need to explain the Venezuelan crisis, right? Everyone is familiar with what is happening. I'm just going to show you this map and say darker regions show more migration. So most of the migrants are actually hosted in Colombia. There are many migrants that are there to stay. Approximately 1.7 million people are in Colombia. And this is an underrepresentation of the true migration population because this is registered migrants. And of course, the borders are porous, so people can be moving and there's no controls as to how many people really are in Colombia. So there is probably a lot more. This actually represents a very big shock for Colombia. So Colombia has a population of 50 million people, so 2 million people is a considerable shock to the population. So what happened? These migration shocks actually began to be dramatic after 2016 in Colombia. So in 2018, the government in office, Mr. Manuel Santos, decided, Francisco Santos, that he wanted to do a census to kind of count how many irregular migrants, those who did not have documents, were in Colombia. And so they went to approximately half of the country. Where did they go? They were to municipalities where they knew, because of the census, the population census, that a lot of Venezuelans were there, or where they, the municipalities said, we want to count Venezuelans here. They went to the media, they went to local organizations and say, we need to count regular migrants. Please come voluntarily. Nothing is going to happen. This is not going to have any consequence. This was advertised through UNHCR, through the World Bank, the IFB, so all kind of institutions that were kind of putting a stamp into the fact that this was not going to have any consequences for migrants. And that was it. It was just to collect data. But later, after a few months after this collection process happened, the president decided anyone who was in that census is going to have the opportunity to be legal in Colombia for 2 years. And the only requisite is you needed to be in that census. And then because they needed to have some idea of how many people they were regularizing. And so that was a way of doing that. What is very interesting, and I need you to understand this for identification purposes, is that when people register in the census, they did not know this was going to be used later as a requisite for the regularization. So one important thing to keep in mind is we probably have selection in the type of people who were registered in the census, maybe those better connected, that trusted the Colombian government, or who knew people in Colombia that told them about this program. And we're not going to be able to observe people who are completely disconnected with all of these trends happening. No? So approximately 500,000 people were found in the census, and approximately 60% of those registered for the PEP. So first surprising fact, you're offering something that I would think, for example, as a researcher, I thought everyone is going to use this because they are basically giving you free everything. You can access formal markets, you can have like a document to access any service, financial services, and 40% of people didn't even apply for it. So that was a surprise as researchers. So what is this thing offering? So legal migratory status, work permit, access to health and
Just
education.
a quick question, Sandra.
Yeah,
Do you have an idea of like who were the people that, based on like observables, who were the people that decided not to register? Were they?
Yeah, so a little bit. So we are going to collect a survey with a control group that did not register either for the census or applied for the VEP. And you're going to see that at baseline they have characteristics that they are less educated, less connected, they have less education. So we would think that the most vulnerable population did not go to the census. That actually, it's the most vulnerable migrants who are outside of this census. Can I ask you a big favor, Andrea? Could you monitor the time for me? I am having trouble keeping the time, and so I should finish at 4:05. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So it's also going to give access to health and education services. So they are going to be ranked by the proxy mean test, SISBEN in Colombia, and this would give them access to any safety net in Colombia and access to banks. So, okay, how do we do this? How do we evaluate this program? So we're going to collect a survey of migrants, and we're going to compare those who are in the treated group, basically those who were in the census and had a possibility of applying to this program. That part was very easy to do because we had the data of all of the people in the census from the Colombian government. So we collected a random sample and contacted them and surveyed them. And that was it, very easy. The tricky part was the other part, where we needed to find people who were irregular in Colombia, in a sense, illegal. I didn't want to use that word, but basically it means that they are afraid of the institutions because they could be deported. And they will be a little harder to find because we did this during COVID. So imagine someone calling you on the phone. Hello, we're doing a study. Are you an irregular migrant or an illegal migrant in Colombia? And they would hang up immediately. So one of the most challenging projects we have ever done. So we tried everything. And so at the end, our ineligible migrants are going to comprise people who are 18 years of age and older, so adults, arriving between January 2017 and December 2018, which is important for identification purposes. I'll explain in a second. So sampling is going to be done in the 3 main cities where the census had presence, the biggest cities where Venezuelans were located and most permits were granted, and the rest of the country. Basically, any place where the census was collected that was a small representative city in Colombia. 4 levels of representativeness, the 3 cities and the rest. When we clean the sample, so we actually collected more households, but when we clean the sample, complete surveys we observed for approximately 2,200 families. Of those, 1,000 are eligible, 1,000 are ineligible, like roughly. And we did actually qualitative interviews, and that's where, Andrea, you're asking me, how do we find them? How do we know why didn't they register? We actually, before constructing the instrument, we did 42 qualitative surveys with IPA Colombia, in which we talked to people who did not register, who were in the census but did not register, and who were in the census unregistered. And we asked them, why did you do it? Why don't you do it? What do you know about people? Do they like it? What are the benefits? We learned several things. One, you should always use Venezuelan numerators to contact them because they don't trust, they have a lot of trust issues. And the language that you use during the interviews, even if it's Spanish, needs to be attested in very simple terms, like you should not use the word usted. You should use the word tú, because that changes trust for them. So interesting things for our study. So I already said this, okay, so where do we find that sample at the end? So basically it came from referrals, the control sample. So the treatment, remember, is just from the census, random sample from the census. And the non-census data, or the people who are not eligible for this program, we found through referrals from other migrants and with databases shared by organizations of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. So basically, we asked the organizations to tell the migrants about our study and let them know we were going to call them. They share with us the data and we call them after. And whenever we found a migrant, we asked them to refer us to another, like a snowballing survey design. Okay, so I'm going to show you here just a little bit of the mechanical outcomes. And what I wanted to show basically, so we actually had a pre-analysis plan. This is not an experiment, but still, because it's a very polemic topic, we wanted to have very precise and concrete mechanical primary and secondary outcomes. So this was pre-specified, registered, and also IRB approved. Here I'm showing you just descriptive statistics for the mechanical outcomes. The mechanical outcomes is what we call the things where we expected to see like a mechanical effect, because that was the objective of the program, like formalization, cisben access, cisben is the proxy mean test, access to subsidized healthcare regime, financial products, transfers from the government. This is what the program intended to do. And I'm just showing you here descriptive statistics. So just the outcome, like the means, nothing else. What I want you to see is that there is a little bit of a very large differences between groups. So non-RAM individuals have lower formal job, lower access to safety net, etc. And actually, I'm not going to cover that in the whole presentation, but this is true for education, for contacts, for the people who are in the census seem to have better outcomes and also have better baseline covariates. So because of that, it was really hard for us to use OLS regression and say, we're going to measure the effect of the program comparing these two groups, because we cannot separate, even after controlling for covariates, what is the truly effect of the program and what is unobservable bias. You know, for example, people in the census might have more grit. They are people who have more, positive energy, and they want to overcome obstacles. That's going to affect our outcomes, and we cannot measure that. So these type of things are a concern. So the same for the primary outcomes. I'm not going to kind of stop there talking a lot about it. So what do we do at the end? So I'm going to just focus on center on the RD results of what we're doing. So I want you to focus on the right, the left upper figure. So on the bottom, we have the date of arrival by week of our sample. So the gray bars are going to show you the density of people in our sample who arrived each week. And the blue line is going to show you the probability of applying to the PEP. And you can see that, of course, when the census changes, anyone who arrives before the census could have applied, but anyone who arrived after the census closed theoretically could not have applied. So we thought we were going to have a zero sharp design. In practice, the raw data shows that there were some irregularities and some people applied later. But this is a very, like say, a credible design to just basically compare people who are arrived closer to that date, and because of the date of arrival, had access to the program or not, but it has no relation with their characteristics. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do an RD, which we compare people close to that date in which the census closed, because that creates an exogenous variation in the probability of application to this program. Importantly, people did not know that this census was going to be used as a prerequisite for the regularization. So here then I show you the standard graphs. Basically, we divide our data on bins and we calculated a mean, and we show the standard, the coefficients, the interval coefficients for each of these bins. And you can see that they never overlap. So there is a very valid discontinuity around the time where the census closed. So we also observe very valid local continuity assumptions, in the sense that we take all the variables that we observe at baseline. Thank you. So basically, all the characteristics by individual before the program began, when they arrived to Colombia and in Venezuela. So think about these individuals before the census even opened. We actually collected retrospective questions on their networks, their work, their sector, their families, their economic conditions, why they migrated to Colombia, whether they have electricity, water, housing, family, siblings, all of that characteristics before this program even began. And what we do here is we show you that there's no discontinuity in any of these variables for the groups of people who arrive around this time when the census closed. So there is a very, let's say, strong argument for the validity of the RD. And then we are also going to show you more general results that are basically a regression of the outcomes, Y by individual I and household J, with a dummy for being in the census or an IV for being in the census controlling for applying to the PEP, what we call LATE. So here we're also going to control for us a battery of covariates. But if, of course, here you can always say, I'm going to use the whole sample. So causality is not as strong as in DARDI, but we have more power because I can use the whole sample, no? So those are the pros and cons of both methodologies. What is interesting is that we find robust effects for the majority of the primary outcomes for both methodologies. So I'm not going to go in a lot of detail over the tables because I want to focus on the results and also on the conclusions. I think are very important. But the tables are all in the paper, so you can, of course, check them in detail. But basically what we find is that the PEP improves well-being, not necessarily formalization. We see negligible effects on formalization, and this is in line with the previous paper. We do not see that they are jumping to the formal sector, but they are actually getting more financial services and more access to state services. Another interesting thing is that they have higher consumption and higher income per capita. So within the informal sector, they have more income and they have more consumption. They are getting better jobs, better negotiation power, and better health outcomes, mental health, but these are the health outcomes are not significant for the IDD. And what is interesting is that we find that they have better labor conditions overall, the secondary outcomes that we explore, for example, reservation wages, job satisfaction, all of that is increasing in the informal sector. No, within the informal sector, they are better off. Less food insecurity, higher feelings of integration with the Colombian society, with more Colombian friends, and better COVID-19 resilience. So overall, a very positive outlook, although we do not see a very important increment in formalization. So here's a little bit of the tables that I showed. I'm not going to kind of stop a lot into that because I want to see if anyone has questions, but they are all in the paper, so you can check them there. And maybe I wanted to finish with two kind of showing you what people say in the interviews, because it's very impactful when we did this. So these were part of the qualitative surveys done by IPA. And so one Venezuelan migrant was telling that he was working since 5 a.m. until 7 p.m. in the rain. And the PEP actually granted him the possibility of being able to negotiate his same job, but with more human conditions, no? Like I cannot work for more than 12 hours in the rain, like with the cold, like I can't denounce you now, or can we negotiate our working conditions? And more people able to open businesses as well. This is a very interesting excerpt from a woman who actually got the PEP and said that she was no longer scared to see the police on the streets. That before she was very scared, like she would see a police or authorities and she would kind of run. So it's very interesting to see that this paper represents so much more than a formalization for me to access. They don't even want, we don't know if they want it. This is not something I can ask you. We didn't ask specifically, would you like to jump to the formal sector? But what we know is that they value it more than that. They value it because it represents their guarantee to be able to be like have peace in Colombia and not be afraid of authorities and report crimes, which is something that probably people have not thought about before. So we see that the PEP grants access to health services, so CISBEN, the proximity test, financial services, negligible effects on formalization. It improved consumption, income, and well-being. We observe bottlenecks when we talk to people. There's still pushback from, for example, banks. Some banks say, despite the fact that you have that, you cannot get an account here. Why? Well, we need a passport, or well, we don't support that number, or we don't know what it is, or we don't know if it's because they don't want to, or because it requires some government effort in, let's say, diffusing the information that this is a valid document. And coupled with the effects that we found earlier in the paper that we published, showing that there's no effects on natives formal sector. So remember, this is not the effects of how Venezuelan migration affects labor market, but it's how the formalization of people who are already in Colombia affects formal market. We do not see any impacts. If you combine that with the fact that this is really good for migrants, it's actually making them more self-sufficient. This is a very powerful case to support this type of programs in other countries. And so with that, I will finish. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. If not, of course, we will also be happy to finish here. No questions. So I think we don't have questions. So It was a great pleasure to
Sorry,
see everyone.
Sandra.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one, I think a small one.
Mhm.
You were able to see some effects of the PEP over education outcomes like matriculation of Venezuelans or something like that.
So we haven't used it as a primary outcome because we are actually collecting a second wave in which we're going to actually more directly try to target some child outcomes, and we're also going to do a wave on child outcomes directly. So more on that in the future.
Perfect.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we need to stop. No, I'm sorry, Andrea. It's just that I
Oh,
think we
yeah.
might have run out of time. I'm sorry about that. So, and we can talk later. So thank you, everyone. It was a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for joining and for your time.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thank
everyone.
you, Sandra.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, Sandra and Andrea.
Bye.
Bye.